Hey, you don't have to hit him like that!
Move back! Please. You're literally the last thing.
Move out! Move out!
This guy's down on the ground in the snow. Let's just knee him in the head. Let's just keep kneeing him in the head. Keep kneeing him in the head.
Hey,
stand down! Oh my gosh! Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! Look what you did! Look what you did to her!
stop! Keep him! Stop it!
If you are involved in this protest, we will actively look to identify you and follow up with financial sanctions and criminal charges. Absolutely. This investigation will go on for months to come.
And with the Prime Minister of Canada, the way he's behaving right now, he's exactly like a tyrant, like a dictator. He's like Ceausescu in Romania.
A nondescript government employee wakes up and heads to a nondescript office building in Beijing. The government employee arrives at his desk and starts attending to his regular duties. Suddenly, a notice from the local propaganda office arrives at his desk. A novel respiratory virus originating in Wuhan is now spreading globally. Posing as a regular citizen, the government employee logs on to various social media accounts and begins posting about how China was saved by lockdowns, closing businesses, implementing vaccine passports, and shipping people off to quarantine camps. This is how you fight the pandemic. Subsequent posts accuse foreign governments of racism for implementing travel restrictions in and out of China. All throughout the country, his colleagues like and share the posts. As a member of the Wumao, colloquially known as China's 50-cent army, the government employee gets paid for posting pro-CCP content on social media platforms. He is but one cog in a vast machinery working night and day to influence public perception, meddle in foreign elections, and shape the global narrative. In Ottawa, a 12th-generation farmer and Canadian veteran is shoveling snow around the National War Memorial. A fence bars him from laying flowers at the grave of a fellow service member. A few weeks prior, even as European countries were dropping their restrictions, the Canadian government announced plans to implement a special tax on unvaccinated individuals. That move was the veterans' last straw. Working-class individuals united to protest the unending COVID restrictions, and the Canadian trucker protest was born. No windows were broken, no buildings were torched, no people were assaulted. The peaceful protests stood in stark contrast to the mostly peaceful ones of yesteryear. And yet, not a single member of parliament met with the truckers. None of the elected officials seemed to care about the working class's grievances. Instead, Canada's state-sponsored media smeared the protesters as far-right extremists. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau condemned them as
the small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa or who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing.
When mean words failed to deter the protesters, Ottawa's mayor declared a state of emergency. Local police began confiscating fuel and started threatening to take people's children away. When those efforts failed, Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act of 1988, effectively placing Canada under martial law. Banks were given the authority to freeze the account of anyone suspected of having participated in the protest. Insurance companies placed vehicles and crowdfunding platforms associated with the protests under terrorism financing oversight. The peaceful protests were declared illegal, and under the emergency powers, anyone who participated, either actively or through donations, was retroactively turned into a criminal. The result?
Move out!
On the 10th of February, the London-based Economist Intelligence Unit released its annual Democracy Index report, titled The China Challenge. For the first time in the report's history, Canada lost its spot amongst the world's top 10 most stable democracies. The report notes that Canada's citizens feel that they have little control over their lives, a sentiment that has been compounded by pandemic-related restrictions on individual freedoms. Interesting. I wonder what Canada's 2022 score will look like. Rhetorical questions aside, let's talk about China. This is how the report describes China's political system. China eschews electoral democracy. It does not have free elections or universal suffrage or a multiplicity system. There is no free print, broadcast, or social media, no freedom of expression, and there are restrictions on the internet. There are no free trade unions, no independent judiciary, and no real equality before the law. The state does not practice religious tolerance and routinely uses torture. While China's recent economic growth has been impressive, that growth depends on the elimination of any mechanism of democratic accountability. Chinese leaders say that the Western electoral democracy model produces inferior leaders, time-wasting deliberations, and a lot of gridlock. And wouldn't you know it, but I can think of at least one prime minister who seems to agree wholeheartedly with the CCP's perspective.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China, because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fast as we need to start investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about, of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted, that I find quite interesting.
The situation in Canada is a perfect example of why the Chinese Communist Party is so scary. This is what happens to a country when the CCP's influence reaches a critical mass. And when I say influence, I don't necessarily mean to imply that the CCP is orchestrating events and pulling strings behind the curtains, although that certainly has happened before in certain contexts. With Canada specifically, I'd argue that Trudeau has become enamored with the CCP's mode of governance. He sees the level of control they have over China's population, and like any other petty tyrant, he wants that same power for himself. After all, if the CCP can get away with it, then why can't people like Trudeau do so as well? And if it can happen in Canada, then you'd better damn well believe that it can happen where you live as well. In fact, the CCP is working overtime to ensure that it does happen where you live as well. How are they doing this, you ask? Manipulating social media perception through the 50-cent army is just one example. Their state bureaucracy employs programs that target politicians at all levels, from heads of state to local officials. Other programs target universities, think tanks, financial institutions, media conglomerates, CEOs, individual journalists, activists, and even international bodies like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Regardless of the specifics, every one of these programs is implemented in service to a singular goal: to strengthen and promote the CCP's global ascension. That fact is becoming harder to ignore by the day. This is how FBI Director Christopher Wray described the situation earlier this year.
There is just no country that presents a broader threat to our ideas, our innovation, and our economic security than China. The Chinese government steals staggering volumes of information and causes deep, job-destroying damage across a wide range of industries. So much so that, as you heard, we're constantly opening new cases to counter their intelligence operations, about every 12 hours or so. In November, just a couple months ago, the Chinese embassy put out letters effectively warning U.S. businesses that if they want to do business in China, they need to fight against Chinese government-related bills in our Congress. And the party doesn't just go after individuals, though. They aim higher and more broadly to try to corrupt our leaders to buy or intimidate acquiescence to their will. That includes trying to undermine our democratic process by influencing our elected officials. And here, too, they play the long game. The Chinese government understands that politicians in smaller roles today may rise to become more influential over time. So they look to cultivate talent early, often state and local officials, to ensure that politicians at all levels of government will be ready to take a call and advocate on behalf of Beijing's agenda.
On the 14th of February, Australia's head of intelligence Mike Burgess echoed these sentiments during a Senate hearing.
Threat to life will always be a priority for ASIO and our partners, but it's important to note that espionage and foreign interference has now supplanted terrorism as our most serious security concern.
Mike's comments come less than a week after his agency foiled a Beijing-backed plot to interfere with Australia's upcoming elections. Following the hearing, CCP mouthpiece The Global Times published an op-ed in support for Anthony Albanese, who leads the Australian Labour Party. That party is incidentally the same one that was targeted by the foiled Beijing-backed plot. What a coincidence! Unfortunately, the CCP's threat is not limited to foreign influence operations. On the 17th of February, the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission held a hearing on China's cyber capabilities. According to expert testimony, China is well on its way to becoming a cyber superpower that rivals or even exceeds the US. According to Wiona Desambre, a research fellow at the Atlantic Council and Harvard Belford Center,
China is a major peer adversary in cyberspace. Its offensive cyber capabilities rival or exceed those of the United States, and I'm happy to go into open source metrics of this, such as vulnerability research, during the Q&A due to lack of time. But the US intelligence community has openly stated that China possesses substantial cyber attack capabilities and can launch cyber attacks that, at a minimum, cause localized temporary disruptions to critical infrastructure. Based on industry observations, the US does not currently have adequate cyber defenses, personnel, supply chain security, or international technical and standards leadership to rival China long-term in cyberspace. On top of this, given how secretive cyber is as a domain, China's capabilities likely exceed the findings that I've compiled here.
Dean Cheng, a senior research fellow for the Heritage Foundation, explained the significance of this development in his written testimony. Victory or defeat in future wars will be a function of the ability to exploit information. According to PLA analysis, the sustained, ongoing development of information technologies, including artificial intelligence, big data, and cloud computing, have combined to create new circumstances for military operations. The result has been essentially a military scientific revolution, requiring new operational forms and theories. During the spoken part of his testimony, he expanded upon the implications of that analysis.
To accommodate these changes, the Gangyao specifically goes to the question, what kind of war will the PLA have to fight, and how will the PLA fight these wars? Here, one of the most important aspects is this creation of the PLA Strategic Support Force. The PLA Strategic Support Force is charged with the conduct of electronic warfare, network warfare, and space warfare. This is essentially China's information warfare force.
In tandem with the development of their cyber capabilities, the CCP has also been aggressively expanding their conventional military forces. On the 15th of February, the Government Accountability Office published a report titled Challenges Facing DoD in Strategic Competition with China. According to the report, China is increasingly assertive and the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. The report goes on to identify 5 areas in which the People's Liberation Army can challenge the US military. Those areas include anti-access and area denial capabilities such as long-range missiles, surface and undersea operations which include the largest navy and shipbuilding capability in the world, cyber capabilities designed to knock an adversary's systems offline, space fighting capabilities such as anti-satellite weapons, and massive investments in artificial intelligence. As was the case with the CCP's foreign influence operations, their military advancements are also having real-world impacts. As reported by the South China Morning Post, China's Central Military Commission recently released new regulations on the testing and assessment of weapons and other military equipment. Those regulations come as Xi demands the military be capable of fighting and winning wars, and as the PLA faces immense challenges in the region, including war preparation and a Taiwan Contingency, which could involve dealing with the United States, Japan, and other countries. Let's examine the so-called Taiwan Contingency. While Taiwan is an independent nation, the CCP falsely claims that Taiwan is a Chinese province. They have on countless occasions pledged to reunite the island with the mainland, by force if necessary. And one of the ways in which that threat manifests itself is through the repeated incursion of Chinese warplanes into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. According to Taiwan's Defense Ministry, at least 173 such incursions have taken place in 2022 alone. Faced with an increasing number of threats and hostile actions from China, Taiwan has stepped up its own military activity by holding live fire drills. The drills come amid growing concerns that cross-strait conflicts could become imminent if the mainland's People's Liberation Army were to seize one of the islets to force self-ruled Taiwan to the table for reunification talks. So far, one of the only things preventing a Chinese invasion is the threat of American intervention. But suppose China's military reaches a point where it surpasses the US's capabilities. If that ever happens, then I believe Taiwan is fucked. And so are we. Let's take Australia as an example. In 2020, Australia called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID. China retaliated to that request by imposing trade sanctions on several Australian goods. Relations between the two countries have been somewhat frosty since then. And as we saw previously, China has since stepped up its efforts to manipulate Australian elections. More recently, China escalated tensions further by introducing their military. On the 19th of February, 2 People's Liberation Army Navy vessels entered Australia's exclusive economic zone. As I believe is their right, Australia deployed a surveillance aircraft to monitor the ships. As the aircraft approached the ships, one of them fired a laser at the aircraft. While no other shots were fired, military-grade lasers present a serious problem because when aimed at aircraft, they can injure pilots or temporarily blind them, which can present safety risks, particularly as they are taking off and landing. Consider the following. What would China have done differently if they had had the world's dominant military force? Instead of merely sanctioning Australia over a perfectly reasonable request, it's conceivable that their navy could have implemented a blockade, thus completely cutting Australia off from all foreign trade. And personally, I don't think that scenario is far-fetched, particularly when considering what Big Daddy Xi recently announced during a Politburo study session. According to the Epoch Times, Xi urged the party to reform domestic laws and foreign-related laws, and to promote the application of Chinese laws in jurisdictions outside of the mainland. He also called for the regime to increase the global influence of its own legal system. This is not the first time the CCP has talked about implementing laws that apply to foreign nationals. Back in 2020, they implemented the National Security Law in Hong Kong. Under that law, promoting Taiwanese democracy could be considered separatism, and criticizing the CCP's many human rights violations could be considered attacking the CCP and its policies. In theory, if you have ever criticized the CCP by writing a critical article or, say, by producing a critical video, then you could be faced with a lifetime in prison. In practice, that's unlikely to happen if you don't live in China. Currently, the CCP doesn't have any way to enforce their laws internationally. Then again, would that still be the case if China emerged as the world's dominant superpower? Personally, I'd prefer to not test that hypothesis. Ask yourself the following question. If China's ascendancy were to result in the spread of authoritarian rule and a rollback of democracy globally, would that bring about an improvement in the lives of millions of ordinary people? I believe the answer to that question is unequivocally no. And while the current situation is grim, the fight is far from over. Take Lithuania as an example. In 2021, the Lithuanian government allowed Taiwan's de facto embassy to open under the name Taiwan instead of Taipei, which in practice means that Lithuania recognized Taiwan as a self-ruled state rather than a territory of China. And that move royally pissed off the CCP, who retaliated by cutting off trade with Lithuania. They also targeted international companies, declaring that they would be banned from doing business in China unless they cut out Lithuanian products from their supply chains. Despite this economic coercion, recent statistical analysis found that Lithuanian exports hit a 10-year high in 2021. If a former Soviet satellite state can withstand Beijing's economic warfare, then other countries can do so as well. India recently set an example for how we can fight back against the CCP's cyber operations by banning Chinese apps that threaten national security. And Wisconsin demonstrated that it's possible to combat the CCP's subversion of universities by passing legislation that prevents Chinese spies from infiltrating university campuses. We are currently engaged in a war of ideas. The values on which our societies are founded are under attack, and our institutions are being subverted and weakened through the CCP's active measures. Still, the examples we just saw demonstrate that it is possible to fight back. And not only can we fight back, but I wholeheartedly believe that we can win. And for victory to be achieved, ordinary people like us need to actively promote freedom and personal liberty. Politicians who stand in our way need to be voted out, and the ones who replace them need to know, in no uncertain terms, that their job is to fight back against the CCP's influence with every diplomatic and economic tool at their disposal. Victory is the only option, because defeat? Well, in closing, I'd like to share a poem that I believe illustrates what will happen in that case. First, they came for the Chinese, and I did not speak out, because I was not Chinese. Then, they came for the Canadians, and I did not speak out, because I was not Canadian. Then, they came for the Taiwanese, and I did not speak out, because I was not Taiwanese. Then, they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And with that, we've reached the end of this week's episode. Do you agree with my assessment? If so, why not show your support by dropping a like down below? Regardless, thanks for watching, and be sure to tune in again next week for more updates. Until then, get after it and stay free.